Where they are right now is where they are right now. Where they need to get to is what? The vision. How they get there is where business analysis is needed. We identify problems in the areas of processes and we make those processes run better. A business analyst is key in helping the company execute their corporate strategy. And there are various services that we offer. Even if the projects that you are working on is not a process improvement project, start your business analysis from the processes. Every organization does something, but let's take a deep dive. At the end of the last segment, when I introduced the BA Mentor, I gave you a few examples as to what business analysis is. So you could say we're going to take more of a deeper dive, we're going to swim in the ocean of understanding as to what business analysis really is and why that is relevant to you. So if you remember last time I mentioned, business analysis really is a discipline of helping businesses run better. But let's take a deep dive. Now, think of it this way. I said to you last time that a BA is like someone that has, tools in its toolbox. BAs offer services. But before we get to the services, let's look at companies now. So we're thinking about companies. Now, whether for-profit or not for-profit, companies have or are made up of three major areas. Companies have processes, so things that they do. Whether documented or undocumented, companies have processes. And these processes, of course, have event triggers. In future videos, we're going to be talking about processes in greater detail and the whole thinking around processes, but processes have triggers. In other words, those triggers are the reasons why processes happen. So organizations have processes. Number two, organizations have people, and those people can be internal members of staff as well as the customers that they serve. And lastly, businesses have applications or solutions, or what we know in simple terms as computer systems, computer applications, and the data that flows through them. Think of any business in the world, any business whatsoever, whether large or small. They do things, so they have processes. What else do they do? Or what else do they have? They have people, They have internal staff, external staff. And lastly, they have systems, computer systems that will enable them to achieve what they do better. And obviously the data that flows through those systems, That's what businesses have. Do you know that business analysis is applied to those three areas? In other words, if you remember from the first segment, I mentioned that business analysis really is a response to problems that exist within businesses, and we diagnose or we identify those problems and we make businesses run better. So you could say we identify problems in the areas of processes and we make those processes run better. Or we identify problems within the people area, or maybe what customers have said and the feedback that they have given. And what do? We rectify, we fix those problems. Some of you BAs may know it as what? Customer journey. Empathy mapping. Don't worry, guys, we're going to get there. And then also, it could be issues with computer systems, applications. System A does not speak to System B. Integration, or interoperability. How do we get System A to speak to System B? Some of you guys know it as what? APIs, And then the data that flows through them. So there's a lot we could look at when it comes to the problems in those three areas. And there's one thing that you need to know. Businesses, charities, for-profit, not-for-profit, the reason why they function or the reason why they do what they do is because they want to deliver a product or a service or both. That's the goal of companies. And why am I saying that? Because every company, whether for-profit or not-for-profit, has a goal or has a vision. So every year you find that companies would release their goals and their visions for the year or the next couple of years. But where they are right now is where they are right now. Where they need to get to is what? The vision. How they get there is where business analysis is needed. In actual fact, if you want to say, from a large-scale company-wide point of view, the gap between where the company is right now and where they want to get to, that's called strategy. In other words, that's where you get your strategic drivers from. So when you work in your company and they'll say, all right, guys, we've released the mission statements for the year. We've released the strategic drivers for the year. That's where they come from. Now, what role does a business analyst play in this? A business analyst is fundamental. A business analyst is key in helping the company execute their corporate strategy. Let's be real. The reason why we have jobs, the reason why I'm a business analyst, the reason why you are a software developer, the reason why you are a project manager, the reason why you are a finance director, the reason why you are a HR manager is because your company, your charity, whatever, if you want to say the legal status of your company, whatever it is, you have a strategy, you have a goal that needs to be achieved. And that's fundamental. And look, let's face it, if we're going to think larger scale, all of us play a part. But back to business analysis. And I'm going to say something else to you. Because of this, because the organization needs to move from point A to point B in order to execute its corporate strategy, it means that that organization needs to what? Transform, or needs to change. And that's where we get business change from, or the statements or the phrase business change. Yeah. So you could say that business analysts are the prime facilitators and executors of business change. That's why we're in jobs. That is why we're in jobs. That is why we've got specialist skill sets. We are facilitators of business change. Now, within business change, there are many stages to business change. I won't get there so much today. That's going to be for another video. But fundamentally, we are facilitators to business change. And in being facilitators to business change, as BAs, you could say we offer services. And there are various services that we offer. Now, let's even go a step deeper. I remember when I worked for a certain organization, I won't name them, but I worked for them, and they're in the marketing profession, the marketing domain. And they are, if you want to say, experts in the marketing domain. And one of the reasons why they brought me in was to help the company transform or move them from an on-premise version of a CRM system, and CRM stands for Customer Relationship Management, to the cloud version. Some of you guys may know it as what? Software as a Service, SaaS, And I'm not saying SaaS because I'm being sassy. No. I'm saying SaaS because that's the abbreviation, Software as a Service. And they brought me in because they wanted me to help facilitate that change. And if you remember what I said earlier, every organization has a 3D view. They have processes, they have people, and they have systems, and obviously the data that flows through those systems. So you could say that it was almost three-sided in terms of how I was going to help move the company from point A to point B. They had strategic drivers that they needed to fulfill, and therefore this particular solution that they wanted to use, some of you may know it already, it's called D365, and it's by Microsoft, Dynamics 365, and it's a CRM tool, and we use, there's both the CRM and the ERP tool. ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning, and that's more for back-end operations like finance, maybe HR, and if you're in a manufacturing profession, then manufacturing, for instance, now, But back to what we were saying. So they brought me in to facilitate change. And what did I do? It was major. First of all, I had to understand what the problems were. And here's a key tip, guys, when it comes to understanding business analysis. And this is something that I found out. Even if the project that you are working on is not a process improvement project, start your business analysis from the processes. This is the reason why. Because every organization does something. We're doing things. We're not in the air. We're not in flux. We're doing things. And since we are doing things, we start from potentially what is the problem with the process. So I started off from there. What I did was that I created something called a process inventory. That's my if you want to say, invention. You're going to see that later on, guys. That's part of the wonderful templates that we're going to give to you. And we're going to show to you. But it's fundamental if you regard yourself as a business analyst. Well, if you regard yourself as a process process re-engineering experts, yeah? Someone that really works closely with processes, you're going to need that, yeah? And I will be the one that will give that to you. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So I started off with, what did they do? And based on what they did, I was able to, if you want to say, itemize, or in simple terms, list every single process that each directorate or department or team or function within the business does. So once I had the list of their processes, as a BA, what I then did was began to document each of their processes. And when I say document each of their processes, what that actually means is that I use tools. You may have heard of a tool called Microsoft Visio. So I used a tool called Microsoft Visio to really understand what they currently did. So it's in the detail. So once I understood what they did, remember guys, there are processes, and processes don't exist by itself. Processes have systems that facilitate better functioning of those processes, and those processes have beneficiaries, which are what? Customers. So you're now seeing how I'm linking all the parts of the business together. So back to what I was saying. I documented those processes down with the stakeholders, understanding what did they do. Then from those processes, I then understood where the problems were with those processes. So each process, we were able to diagnose what the problems were. But that's the starting point. I then asked the stakeholders, how do you want these processes to operate going forward? Some of you guys may know this as the to be, yeah, or future state. And then what I then did was that I looked at the problems, sat down with them to see how we can, if you want to say, rectify those problems, and then derived their requirements. Again, a requirement, we're going to touch upon this in future segments. A requirement is a response to a business need. So in other words, how did I move them from their documented as-is processes, where we identified the problems, to documenting their future states to be processes using the same tool, Microsoft Visio, and then coming up with the requirements that help them move from where they were with their problems to where the future state or the to be processes, which really reflects the correction of the problem, but also a better running, a better functioning of the actual process. I then derive requirements, or in short, needs that will help address that. And as a result, we were able, in short, to move the whole organization from the on-premise version of Microsoft Dynamics to the cloud. And that was major, large scale. And why did I say all of that? I said all of that because I said that BAs are facilitators of change, and we truly are facilitators of change, you know. So you could say that BAs would require many competencies, many abilities, many skills in order to, if you want to say, bring people along with them that will help support the change. If you found value in what you've listened to, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button and share. And remember, if you have any questions, pop it in the comment section. Still on the topic of what is business analysis, I thought I'd mention something to you that's really, really important. Hey, everything that I'm mentioning to you is really, really important, right? When it comes to business analysis, yeah, you can have all the tools in your toolbox, but the greatest assets to your success as a BA, wait for it, are people. What do I mean when I say people? For you, that is a business analyst, you probably know it as stakeholders. At every stage of the business analysis journey, you will be engaging with people. And that is so key. In fact, this makes or breaks your execution as a BA, or the project that you're working on. This makes or breaks your success when it comes to that project. What do I mean when I say people? Well, you're relating with people so that you can understand, for example, what's currently happening. Why do we have problems? You want to introduce your tools to them so that you can help solve the problem. You may want to bring people in meetings so that you can understand or diagnose or even brainstorm solutions, potential, if you want to say solutions to that particular problem. Now, when I say solutions, I'm not referring to solutionizing, because solutionizing is really coming up with a system that helps solve a problem. That's not that. I'm talking about actual options to deal with the problem. But people are key. And I'd mentioned this. EQ, many of you will know this as emotional quotient, which is emotionally intelligent. If you really want to succeed as a BA, then emotional intelligence is key. Understanding people, knowing how to relate with people. People will buy into you first before they buy into your tools. In essence, you can come up to someone and say, hey, I've got a RACI matrix. Hey, I want to run a workshop. Oh, hey, I want to document a process map using a methodology called Lean Six Sigma, or whatever you want to call it. That's great. But if they don't like you, I'm sorry to sound so frank, but if they don't like you, then they're not going to take or even receive what you're going to give to them. I would say this. Like I said to you before earlier, my background is that my parents are Nigerian. Now, as Nigerians, we're quite forward and we're quite direct with one another. So we say it how it is. If you're wearing a shirt and I didn't like the shirt, when I was much younger, we would say, I do not like the shirt, and no one will be offended. And that really formed my thinking as it relates to how I related with people. But then when I became a business analyst, I realized that that way of speaking did not fly. You know, that direct, if you want to say, form of providing information to people. So I really had to understand how to speak to people. Because when I understood that, I kid you not, my career as a business analyst skyrocketed. Because I became so good at engaging with people. I became so good at understanding people. And that is the key. People care about how you make them feel. Once they care about how you make them feel, then they'll buy into all the tools that you have as a business analyst. And that is so important. An example of that is when I worked for a particular organization, probably at a time whereby, you know, the whole UK and pretty much the whole world were really in a state of flux. And what do I mean when I say a state of flux? It was during the pandemic. Around 2019, 2020, yeah? And you can imagine when the UK was pronounced to be on lockdown, so no one leaving their homes, I was working from home 100% of the time. And of course, I still had to perform my role as a business analyst. Again, it was that particular project that I was working on for that marketing organization, whereby we had to transition the organization. So remember, change and transformation, yeah? Or help the organization change from the on-premise version of a particular CRM tool or customer relationship management tool to the cloud, software as a service, Microsoft Dynamics or Dynamics 365. And I remembered I was quite daring, almost, you know, slightly cheeky in that when I would share screen, so I'd create a Teams meeting. In creating a Teams meeting, I would then obviously invite the people to the Teams meeting, the stakeholders. They would then come to the Teams meeting. And you can imagine it was a really dire period at the time. And I really harnessed my great stakeholder engagement and stakeholder management skills. And this is what I did. I said, every time I would share screen, maybe we need to document an as-is or a to-be process map to be improved, yeah? I would say to the stakeholders, once you've seen the screen that I've shared, shout bananas. No joke, guys. As in every single time. To a point that it became a culture and part of the organization, that every time Peter shared the screen, even if Peter doesn't say shout bananas, you'd have a member of staff who attended the Teams meeting. They'll say bananas, and I'll be like, yes, guys, you've got it. And that's so important. Now, how did I know that? I understood, looked at the body language, but I also got to know the people as well. And when I say I got to know the people, as BAs, we've got to take it a step further. Yes, they are our colleagues, but we spend more time with them than even our children, our family, our friends, our wives, our husbands, our aunties, our uncles, yeah? So why don't we make best use of each day? So what I would actually take a liking to the actual individual. So I would ask them, how was your day? How was your evening? What did you get up to? How was your weekend? And I wouldn't ask it as a matter of a robotic sense, but I'd ask it because I genuinely cared, to a point that we actually had proper conversations, real conversations, and people realized that I cared about them first. Remember what I said earlier? If people feel that they care about you, they will then buy into what you have to offer to them. I can't stress to you how important that is. Technically, that's called stakeholder engagement and stakeholder management. So then they will buy into your RACI matrix, yeah? I'm sure you know what a RACI matrix is. It really looks at the responsibilities that those involved in the project has against the tasks that need to be done. And it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Or even your power interest grids, I call them pigs, yeah, which looks at how we relate to stakeholders based on the interest that they have and their power. Again, we've got a lifetime to talk about these tools. I'm just trying to say to you that because I got to know them, I then introduced these tools and hey presto, it was like magic. But it's not. If you really care about people, they will care about you. Well, what have we covered so far? 1, BAs are facilitators of business change. 2, the key components to the success of what we do is our engagement with people, with stakeholders, and the effective engagement of that as it matters. But one thing that's so key that we ought to know and that we need to know and that you guys need to know is this. BAs are effectively specialists that offer certain services. And here's a general view of the kinds of services that BAs offer. The first one, I like to call it the Sherlock Holmes effect. Sherlock Holmes and Watson, detectives, yeah? And it's all about, if you, for example, were parachuted into a project, whether it's at the beginning or even in the middle, you first of all want to understand what on earth is going on. You want to understand why the project and what the problems are. And as BAs, yeah, we are your Sherlock Holmes and Watsons that really understand, or if you use the words, investigate what is currently happening now. There are 2 approaches. There are qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative looks at the quality of things. In other words, what is currently happening now? What do we need? And quantitative looks at how much of it. Yeah. So, for example, if you wanted to understand what is currently happening now, some of your qualitative approaches could be using techniques like interviews. Yeah. I know. I'm sure you've heard of that before. And interviews is one-to-one. It's really understanding or sitting down with a stakeholder to understand from their perspective and their point of view what the problem is. So you come with key questions and they provide you with what? Key answers. Another kind of, if you want to say, qualitative approach are workshops. A number of us have conducted workshops. Workshops are effectively where groups of stakeholders come together and we understand or address a particular topic or problem or issue or statement. Yeah, we look at a particular topic, issue, or statements to identify what the problems are and how we can solve those problems. So typically in a workshop, a scenario, an idea would be given. Then you'd be broken down into groups. So for example, if you were 12 in a room, you'd have 6 on one side, 6 on the other side. And then the creative juices will be flowing. You guys will be ideating, coming up with ideas in how to solve a particular problem. Then once you've come up with those ideas, you then take maybe potentially one idea and see how we can use that to solve or test out the problem or provide a potential solution to the problem. Workshops. Now, I've given you one way workshops can be conducted. There are many ways workshops can be conducted, and I'm sure you guys know many ways. Yeah, but that's workshops, for instance. Now, some quantitative, if you want to say, techniques that could be used in order to understand or investigate what is currently happening now is maybe surveys. Yeah. Conducting surveys and questionnaires. They are really good when you need to get a large amount of information from a large population. And I'll give an example. When I worked in the public sector for a particular local authority or local council, I was working on a particular project that was focused on redesigning the HR service. HR, as you know, stands for human resources, for instance now. So we know that. And we really needed to understand where the problems were at the time with that HR service. So what we did, or what I was, if you want to say, tasked to do, was to create a survey. And then that survey was then sent out to a large sample of staff across the organization to then understand from that large sample size what the key problems were. Then we would then collate those problems and then work towards dealing with those solutions, for instance now. So the first service that BAs would potentially offer is to investigate what's currently happening now. What is the outcome of that? A problem statement. Having a well-formed problem statement that will then take forward to then provide solutions to it. That's the first thing. The next thing, and which is major, which all of you may know, is something called requirements analysis, or some call it requirements engineering. Yeah, that's, if you want to say, our bread and butter as BAs. Yeah, and when it comes to the business analysis profession, when people think about business analysts, they think about requirements. So what is a requirement? You know, a requirement really is a response to a need. There are certain stages when it comes to the service we offer as it relates to requirements. Generally for me, I tend to call the first stage the requirements gathering stage, which is the initial stage where we're just trying to understand the needs of our stakeholders. Yeah, and that's really high level. Then the next stage is, I would like to call it, it's more of the requirements, if you want to say, analysis stage, whereby we're analyzing the requirements. Now, what does that actually mean? Say, for example, in the first stage, the requirements gathering stage, stakeholder A, let's call himself Dave, and stakeholder B, let's call herself Samantha. Yeah. So Dave says he needs to store data, you know, whatever the data he wants to store. And then Samantha says she wants to backup or archive data. They're saying the same thing. That's what the analysis stage is all about. That's stage 2. Then stage 3 is around documenting requirements. What do I mean when I say documenting requirements? Well, generally in business analysis, there's 2 ways that you could document. You could document using literal statements. Yeah. Some of you guys may know this as user stories if you're working in an agile setting, and we're going to talk about agile a lot in future, or waterfall type requirements. Yeah, waterfall just basically means non-agile. Yeah, again, waterfall is a way of software delivery, but we're going to talk about that another time. There's so much. The world is our oyster, guys. There is so much to talk about. Typical waterfall requirements could be the system shall do this and the system shall do that. So that's literal text-based, if you want to say, needs or requirements that are documented down. But supporting those text-based requirements are models. So that's part of the documentation of requirements as well. So say, for example, if you had a requirement that says, as an admin member of staff, I want to be able to download or run a report so that it could be a useful tool for management. You could then support that with a use case diagram, for instance, now, to show where that would happen and how that would happen. And then you could break that use case down into a use case description to show how you run that particular report. So that's the, if you want to say, the documentation stage. After you've documented those requirements need to be signed off. Yeah. So the requirement sign off stage, I can't stress to you how important that is. You know, when I started off as a BA, I really took that for granted, whereby you'd have requirements and you just take them away and give them to a developer. No, because you need to ensure that your stakeholders who you took time to sit down with to document those requirements, or if we go back to the stages, to what? Gather their requirements, analyze the requirements, document the requirements, that they're happy with the final and finished version. So that is the sign-off stage. You know, so you're ensuring that your stakeholders are happy, they sign it off, to the point or to the degree that we can then pop them into, if you're going to work in an agile setting, a product backlog, or a non-agile setting, a business requirements document. So what's the value there? The value there is that ultimately, after we have done the necessary investigation, we then need to understand the needs. And those needs is then what we'll do or what we'll apply to support the future state or the to be for the customer or for the stakeholder. The next service that we as BAs offer is what? Process improvements. You know what I said in the last segment, that businesses are always doing things. And because they're doing things, they have processes in place. Yeah? Whether those processes are documented or undocumented, things are still being done. So as BAs, another service that we could offer is what? Process improvement, which really looks at what the organization is doing now, what they want to do in the future. So documenting what they're doing now, understanding what they're doing now, highlighting and finding out where the problems are with that process, and then drawing up or designing, you've heard of that before, yeah? Designing a future state process, yeah? That's so key. That's so important. So we help facilitate that from down to understand what they're doing, documenting those processes, and even to a greater degree, costing up the processes. So finding out how much those processes cost. And I've got a template for that, which I can show you how to use in future segments. So watch this space, right? The next service that we offer is user acceptance testing. Some of you know this as what? UAT. And UAT is part of the SDLC, which stands for the software delivery or software development lifecycle. Irrespective of if you go through the waterfall software development lifecycle or the agile software development lifecycle, doesn't really matter. The software that is what's built needs to be what? Tested by a normal quality assurer, a specialist tester. But once it's been tested and it passes the test, it needs to then get tested by the users or tested by the business. And these are people who would actually use the software. So the BA, the value that the BA offers is that the BA would draw up the test scripts, yeah? Linked to the acceptance criteria, yeah, which was linked to the user story or their requirements. Again, we're going to touch upon that, yeah. And then we would write the test scripts and we will provide, if you want to say, the direction to the stakeholders to ensure that they know what to test, how to test, and where to record the test results. And the test results really is either pass or fail. Yeah, so we facilitate and administer that. That's really, really important. The next service that we offer, yeah, is business change deployment. In other words, getting the business ready for the change. You've worked on a massive process improvement project. You've documented the as-is processes. You've documented the to-be processes. Those to-be processes have now, they've been signed off and is now part of BAU, business as usual, yeah? So in other words, the business is adopting these processes as their new processes. That's important. But the question we need to ask ourselves is the business ready for this new change? Have we looked at factors, every single underlying factor to ensure that the business, or more particularly that team or that department, are they ready for this change? And what kind of change will it be? Have we looked at the different emotional responses to change? You guys may know about it, the Sarah curve. Initially there's shock, then there's anger, then there's rejection, then there's acceptance, and then there's hope. Have we looked at that? Have we considered that? Have we also considered that when it comes to business change, there are different ways to what? Deploy the change. Is it the big bang? We switch off the old system and switch on the new system. Or do we run systems in parallel so that they can learn from each other? That's got its pros and cons, yeah? Or do we pilot in a particular area? Or is there a phased implementation? So there's so many things to look at when it comes to business change deployment. And lastly, the last service that we majorly offer as BAs is really the question that needs to be answered, which is, should we or should we not go ahead with the project? And that looks at what? Business case generation. That looks at what? Feasibility assessment. Business case generation, what is a business case? A business case effectively is a document that answers the question, should we or should we not go ahead with the project, and why? Of course, the business case contains the risks, the impacts, the issues, the costs, the benefits, as well as if you want to say, the return on investment. But really, it's the business case is the heart of business change. The business case is constantly being looked at. The business case is constantly being reviewed to ensure that if we do embark on a project, we are on track. And that's key. So those are the 5 major services that we as BAs offer. And remember, it's still linked to what we've been talking about all along, which is, what is business analysis?